will you commit to taking down that account, Steve Bannon's account?
Senator, no, that's not what our policies would suggest that we should do in this case.
I see a problem here. They're pushing for the silencing of posts and people, specific posts and people. It couldn't be more clear. With Facebook being as cozy with governments as it is, it's easy to see how this can be expanded to silence all kinds of information if that's what the government wants, as long as the government puts the right label on the post to target it for Facebook. I mean, in this example, it's Facebook being like, nah, you're asking for more censorship than we're comfortable with. But Facebook's pretty comfortable with a lot of censorship.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 224th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. In case this is your first time listening to Congressional Dish, this is a podcast about Congress, and in this episode, we are going to be looking at some congressional hearings. They were doing some investigations into the social media companies that were of particular interest to me because we just had an election, and it was impossible not to notice during that election period that the social media companies, Facebook and Twitter in particular, are different now than they were a few months ago before the elections. And I think the most obvious change in my world were the Twitter labels, because I spend a lot of time on Twitter. It's the only social media where I've even bothered to develop a following at Jen Briney. I like Twitter the best because it's the easiest place to share and receive information. And so, yeah, I've built a following on Twitter, and I just started noticing all these labels, particularly on the tweets of Donald Trump. Now, as I'm recording this, it is Tuesday, November 24th. Donald Trump is still the president, but he is also still refusing to concede the election that he just lost and is consistently tweeting lies about that election. I mean, just this morning, he said that this was an all caps rigged election again. And then he sent out some more specific lies, like the one that he keeps saying that, like, Republicans were locked out of the vote counting process in Wisconsin, which is just simply untrue. And underneath his tweets, like that one, and like so many of his tweets lately that have been full of lies, there is now a symbol with an encircled exclamation point next to a blue link that says, quote, "This claim about election fraud is disputed," unquote. And when you click on the link, it takes you to a list of tweets from corporate news outlets like USA Today, the Associated Press, NBC News, and other blue checkmark people with information about how rare voter fraud is in the United States. And now Trump's retweeting crazy rants about America becoming communist by actor Randy Quaid. And Randy Quaid's tweets also now have the labels. And so, you know, it's fucking madness out there, and I can promise you that I am going to unfollow Donald Trump as soon as he is no longer the president. But now that he is still the president, it's just impossible not to notice how many of his tweets have been labeled. And it's not just his. There's a lot of people that are getting these labels, and these labels are new. Then there's Facebook. They made changes too. You know, like in the weeks before the election, I couldn't sign on to that digital hellscape without being reminded to vote over and over again. And then I also went on to the Facebook page of one of my crazier Trump-loving Facebook friends, someone I've been Facebook friends with for a very, very long time. And sure enough, quite a few of her posts had labels that said content unavailable, or had a message over the top of whatever she was trying to post that said false information checked by independent fact checkers. Underneath those posts, there were related articles pointing to factcheck.org, The Dispatch, now I don't know what that is, and Lead Stories, which is another fact-checking website that I had never heard of. And I know for a fact that this person believes and posts whatever lies are sent to her by people on Team Conservative. This is not a person that cares about true and false. If her team says it, it gets posted, which is why I went to her page just to see like what was going on. But looking at her page, it is undeniable that Facebook is censoring it. There's a lot of unavailable posts. That's the most striking thing. The fact check ones don't really bother me because I have the ability to see what the post was, but so many of her posts are just unavailable. And there's no explanation for why they're unavailable, just something very vague being like, there are reasons this could have been taken down, but they don't give me a reason. But that is also something that is new on Facebook. And there's also these other outlets, like I said, factcheck.org, the Dispatch, Lead Stories, they're elevating these outlets as the arbiters of truth. And some of them I have never heard of before. And so basically, I just wanted to know what was going on. And Congress had quite a few hearings lately about social media censorship. And so I watched 6 of them. And today I'm going to give you the highlights from those hearings. Now, the main problem, as I see it, is that we have just a few companies that have transformed themselves into information gatekeepers. And these gatekeepers are now using their power to decide what we can see and what we can share. The fact that just a few companies, namely Google, Facebook, and Twitter, account for so much, and really, not even really Twitter, it's really Google and Facebook, but they account for so much of the online infrastructure that's commonly used to share information. The fact that there are so few of them is having a profound effect on what information is shared, how it's packaged, and whom it's delivered to. And this is not just a problem for Americans. This is happening to humans around the world. So this is Representative Pramila Jayapal. Apologies if I said her first name wrong, but she's from Washington. She's a representative in the House. And in this clip, she is speaking to Sally Hubbard, who is the Director for Enforcement Strategy at the Open Markets Institute, which is an organization launched in 2017 dedicated to combating corporate concentration and monopoly power. This hearing took place in June 2019 and was not aired on television in the United States.
So, Ms. Hubbard, let me start with you. You were an Assistant Attorney General for New York State's Antitrust Division. You've also worked as a journalist. Which online platforms would you say are most impacting the public's access to trustworthy sources of journalism, and why?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I think in terms of disinformation, the platforms that are having the most impact are Facebook and YouTube. And that's because of their business models, which are to prioritize engagement, engaging content because of the human nature that the survival instinct, we tend to tune into things that make us fearful or angry. And so by prioritizing engagement, these platforms are actually prioritizing disinformation as well. It serves their profit motives to keep people on the platforms as long as possible, to show them ads and collect their data. And because they don't have any competition, they're free to pursue these destructive business models without having any competitive constraint. They've also lacked regulation. Normally, corporations are not permitted to just pursue profits without regard to the consequences.
So lack of competition for Facebook and Google, which bought YouTube, is definitely a problem. And here's one of the main reasons why they have no real competitors.
Facebook has repeatedly acquired rivals, including Instagram and WhatsApp. And Google's acquisition cemented its market power throughout the ad ecosystem as it bought up the digital ad market spoke by spoke, including Applied Semantics, AdMob, and DoubleClick. Together, Facebook and Google have bought 150 companies in just the last 6 years. Google alone has bought nearly 250 companies.
Now, this purposeful consolidation via mergers and acquisitions by Facebook and Google is directly affecting the news industry in a negative way. Here's David Shavern. He is the president and CEO of the News Media Alliance, which is a union of almost 2,000 news organizations. Here he is testifying in that same off-C-SPAN hearing.
The platforms and news organizations' mutual reliance would not be a problem if not for the fact that the concentration among the platforms means that a small number of companies now exercise an extreme level of control over the news. And in fact, a couple of dominant firms act as regulators of the news industry. Only these regulators are not constrained by legislative or democratic oversight. The result has been to siphon revenue away from news publishers. This trend is clear if you compare the growth in Google's total advertising revenue to the decline in the news industry's ad revenue. In 2004, Google's U.S. revenue was $2.1 billion, while the newspaper industry accounted for $48 billion in advertising revenue. In 2017, in contrast, Google's U.S. revenue had increased over 25 times to $52.4 billion, while the newspaper industry's ad revenue had fallen 65% to $16.4 billion.
And here's the effect of more advertising money shifting from news creators to the companies that maintain digital infrastructure. This is David Pitofsky. He is the general counsel at News Corp, which is the company that is run by the right-wing propagandist Rupert Murdoch and his son. And so this company is the one responsible for inflicting Fox News upon the world. But they've also used their market power to gobble up legitimate sources of journalism, like the Wall Street Journal. Regardless, this guy is the News Corp lawyer.
The erosion of advertising revenue undercuts our ability to invest in high-quality journalism. Meanwhile, the platforms have little, if any, commitment to accuracy or reliability. For them, a news article is valuable if viral, not if verified.
Which means the news industry, if they want clicks, are incentivized to create articles and videos that will go viral instead of pieces of journalism with nuance, pieces of journalism that tell uncomfortable truths. Fox News is an excellent example of a news organization that specializes in emotion-stirring clickbait. They know how to make a piece go viral. But I can promise you, as someone who hosts this show, that nuance doesn't go viral. When you say it's complicated, that doesn't go viral. When you say all of your political teams are wrong, that doesn't go viral. When something is long but important, that doesn't go viral. Cute cat does cartwheel. That's what goes viral. Your side is the best side. That goes viral. The other guy is an asshole. That goes viral. And so everyone who funds their work with ads is chasing viral. They're not chasing nuance. They're not chasing verification. And the only reason that viral matters is because the companies in charge of the information infrastructure and the companies producing the information are all chasing the same advertising money. But it's not a fair fight for the ad money. Here's David Pitofsky again. He's the lawyer for Fox News and Friends.
Unfortunately, in the news business, free riding by dominant online platforms, which aggregate and then reserve our content, has led to the lion's share of online advertising dollars generated off the back of news going to the platforms. Many in Silicon Valley dismiss the press as old media, failing to evolve in the face of online competition, but this is wrong. We're not losing business to an innovator who has found a better or more efficient way to report and investigate the news. We're losing business because the dominant platforms deploy our news content to target our audiences, to then turn around and sell that audience to the same advertisers we're trying to serve.
And that makes sense. You know, think about it. Facebook, Google, Twitter, they don't make anything. We make the content. They just give us somewhere to put it. They provide the online infrastructure we use for sharing. But we all know that Facebook, Google, and Twitter have the power to determine whose work gets put on top, whose work gets seen. They determine how many people view our work with their search rankings and algorithms. When you Google something, how often do you get to the 5th page before you've clicked on something? Almost never, right? The first page is where we find most of what we're looking for, and so being high on Google's rankings and doing whatever Google wants you to do to be there, it's important if you want to get clicks and make money off of people seeing ads on your site. But even being first in the Google rankings can hurt you. I didn't realize it until producing this episode, but there are a lot of times now that I don't click on anything after doing a Google search anymore, because Google is now taking little pieces from articles with answers to my question and putting them right in the Google search results. Like, for example, this morning, I woke up and my ears were plugged. It's like, you know, the feeling you get when you're on an airplane, but instead of, just swallowing and it goes away, swallowing wasn't clearing it. And so I Googled, what can I do to clear my ears? And the answer appeared right in the search result. Now, the answer was written by Mayo Clinic, but I didn't click on the Mayo Clinic link. I just read the paragraph that Google had sampled from the Mayo Clinic article. Google calls that sampling a featured snippet. But that means that I didn't see the advertisements on the Mayo Clinic's page. And Mayo Clinic never got to tell those advertisers that I had read what they wrote. How many thousands of times per day does this happen to them? And so by sampling Mayo Clinic's work like that, Google is depriving the Mayo Clinic of what they need to survive on an ad-based business model. So in this instance, even though they were the first result in the Google search rankings, Google actually is hurting their business. And this goes for anyone else whose business is based on providing information, especially news. Here's David Shavern, again, the president of the News Media Alliance, the union of news organizations.
The effect of this revenue decline on publishers has been terrible, and they've been forced to cut back on their investments in journalism, That is the reason why newsroom employment has fallen nearly a quarter over the last decade. One question might be asked is, if the platforms are on balance having such a negative impact on the news media, then why don't publishers do something about it? The answer is they cannot, at least under the existing antitrust laws. News publishers face a collective action problem. No publisher on its own can stand up to the tech giants. The risk of demotion or exclusion from the platforms is simply too great. And the antitrust laws prevent news organizations from acting collectively. So the result is that publishers are forced to accept whatever terms and restrictions are imposed on them.
So I found that one really interesting thing to note, maybe something that we need to change, because current laws are basically prohibiting content creators, the news organizations, and people like me from collectively suing the gatekeepers for decisions that they make that hurt our businesses, decisions that they make that favor some kinds of content over others. And that's something that probably needs to change, because the idea that most of us that publish information on the internet are powerless against the choices of Facebook, Google, and Twitter, that rings true to me. The example that stands out most starkly in my head is when Facebook started charging for page views. Because back when I started this show in 2012, there were, I don't even know how many businesses that had built their entire brands around Facebook. They had hundreds of thousands of people who went out of their way to follow those business pages, and after clicking follow, would see those businesses' posts in their Facebook timelines. But between 2012 and 2014, Facebook decided to require business pages to pay Facebook if they wanted their followers to actually see the posts. Facebook, of course, denied that this was done to make money, but the results speak for themselves. People who had built their businesses over the previous 7 years on Facebook had their posts' organic reach plummet, and they couldn't do a damn thing about it. They had to either pay up or die. And it destroyed, I don't even know how many businesses who had built their brand on Facebook and didn't have thousands of dollars in monthly ransom to suddenly pay. And so flash forward to now. Here's how it works on Facebook right now, using Congressional Dish as an example. As of November 23rd, 2,798 people, so almost 2,800 people, have gone out of their way to like Congressional Dish on Facebook, which in theory should put Congressional Dish's posts in your feed so you can see them. But over a week after releasing episode 223, only 459 people have been shown that episode's post, which is about 16% of the people who requested to see the Congressional Dish posts. And that's actually pretty good. The episode before that, which has been out for 3 weeks now, the summary of the 116th Congress, that was only shown to 288 people, or about 10% of the people who followed the page. Now, the difference between the two is that more people shared the post-election episode, and so it got more views. And so more people do see the posts when you share them on your own feeds, which is how tailoring my work to go viral would come into play. If it's clickbaity and goes viral, if it encourages people to share by stirring up their emotions, then I don't have to pay to get eyeballs on it. But if it's a post that's not meant to stir up emotion, but instead just give information, I have to pay the gatekeeper to open the gates. And so, in the information portal, where Facebook gives me this information about how few of you actually get to see the Congressional Dish posts, Facebook has a big Boost Post button next to every post. Now, Boost Post is the button you use to pay Facebook. And next to the Boost button, it says, quote, "When you boost this post, you'll show it to more people," unquote. But that's a lie. Because when I boost the post, that means that Facebook will show it to more people. They're the ones that chose not to. But if I wanted to guarantee that 2,800 people, the number of people who have followed my page, would actually see the post, then I would have to pay Facebook over $200 for every post. And this is one of the reasons why I've never bothered building Congressional Dish on Facebook. I learned from watching this happen to people, and so I don't trust them as a business partner because I've seen them change their rules to their own benefit out of nowhere in the pursuit of profits. And their policy is that if I don't like it, I can go fuck myself. Facebook doesn't need me. They think I need them. And honestly, if I were funded by digital ads, I probably would. And so thank you again to all producers who support this show and the value for value business model, where you pay the show whatever amount matches the amount of value you receive from it. This business model is what incentivizes me to create the best episode I can, providing nuance and explaining complications instead of having to design these episodes to go viral. You and the value for value model are what has freed this show from the gatekeeper's web. But corporate news, They're very much stuck in the web, or at least they think they are. And the effect on the quality of journalism, I think we all know that it hasn't been good. And so what do the gatekeepers have to say about this? Well, here's Nathaniel Gleicher. He is the head of security policy at Facebook. Here he is testifying to the House in June of 2020.
Certainly, people are drawn to clickbait. They're drawn to explosive content. I mean, it is the nature of clickbait to make people want to click on it. But what we've found is that if you separate it out from the particular content, people don't want a platform or an experience that is just clickbait. They will click on it if they see it, but they don't want it prioritized. They don't want their time to be drawn into that and all the emotional freight of it. And so we are trying to build an environment where that isn't the focus, where they have the conversations they want to have. But I agree with you. A core piece of this challenge is people seek out that type of content wherever it is. I should note that as we're thinking about how we prioritize this, one of the key factors is who your friends are, the pages and accounts that you follow, and the assets that you engage with. That's the most important factor in sort of what you see. And so people have direct control over that because they're choosing the people they want to engage with.
Except that's not true. 2,800 of you have chosen to see the Congressional Dish posts, but Facebook is keeping them out of your feed until they get paid by me. And even with the people in our lives, Facebook's algorithms is determining who we see. Just a few weeks ago, I randomly thought of a friend from high school. I haven't seen her in ages, but I heard she was working at our former high school, and so I looked her up on Facebook. We've been friends on Facebook now for like 20 years. And when I went to her page, I was shocked to see that she posts stuff on Facebook all the time. And yet she never shows up on my feed. Why? It's not like I ever told Facebook that I wasn't interested in her. I like this chick. I wouldn't do that. No, it's because Facebook's algorithms have decided who I get to see all the time. And it's the same people over and over again. But they're not people that I chose. Facebook doesn't let us control what we see. Otherwise, following an account would put that account's posts in our feeds. And I would see all of my friends' posts. It really is that simple. And so here's Facebook telling Congress that they've given us control of our feeds, but it's a lie. And I wish Congress would push back harder on answers like that one, but they didn't. Google was also asked to address their search ranking algorithms, and Google was not at all shy about admitting that they use their search results power to determine what we get to see. In fact, Google seemed to be proud of it because their director for law enforcement and information security at Google, Richard Salgado, talks about it like it's an accomplishment.
In search, ranking algorithms are an important tool in our fight against disinformation. Ranking elevates information that our algorithms determine is the most authoritative above information that may be less reliable. Similarly, our work on YouTube focuses on identifying and removing content that violates our policies and elevating authoritative content when users search for breaking news. At the same time, we find and limit the spread of borderline content that comes close but just stops short of violating our policies.
So content that is the most authoritative gets prioritized. But algorithms determine what is authoritative. That really couldn't be less clear. But if you go to YouTube and look up any topic and news, you'll get a long list of segments produced by corporate sources. That must mean that corporate news is what is being considered the most reliable, even though it was corporate news that lied us into Iraq and that doesn't bother to do on-air fact checks of their guests. When it comes to reliability, I trust independent journalists like Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald, and independent organizations like Democracy Now! Infinitely more than I trust New York Times, who lied us into Iraq, or Fox News or MSNBC, which we all know at this point are mouthpieces for the Republican and Democratic parties, and who consistently put paid industry shills on the air as experts without disclosing that they make money in the fields that they discuss on air. But just go to YouTube, type in any topic. Corporate outlets make up the vast majority of the top search results, and that wasn't always the case. But while we can guess by searching that the Google algorithms favor corporate sources, without more information about the algorithms, we can't say that definitively. The algorithms are like their secret sauce, but we aren't given the ingredients. But refreshingly, I do have to say that Twitter's CEO, Jack Dorsey, brought up algorithms a few times, unprompted, and here's what he said.
We have transparency around our policies. We do not have transparency around how we operate content moderation, the rationale behind it, the reasoning. And as we look forward, we have more and more of our decisions, of our operations, moving to algorithms, which have a difficult time explaining why they make decisions, bringing transparency around those decisions. And that is why we believe that we should have more choice in how these algorithms are applied to our content, whether we use them at all, so we can turn them on or off, and have clarity around the outcomes that they are projecting and how they affect our experience.
And I'm genuinely excited to hear that because I would love to turn the algorithms off. When I first joined Twitter, it was just in chronological order. I would see whatever someone posted now. I loved it. You know, that's what got me hooked on Twitter in the first place. It was the best place for breaking news. You could just log on to Twitter and whatever was happening in the moment. If there was an earthquake, that's all everyone was talking about. If the Grammys were on, everyone was talking about the Grammys. It was so perfect for now. And their algorithm screwed it all up. Like I can log on to Twitter right now and the top post in my feed might be something from 2 days ago. And I don't know why they do that. And I don't know how to make it stop. And so even though Twitter is still my go-to because it makes information sharing the easiest, it's so much harder to use now. But the big picture, via market power and their algorithms determining what people see, Facebook, Google, and Twitter are our modern day information gatekeepers. And so what are they doing with that power lately? Well, my suspicion was right. That when it came to the election, they were exerting their power to control what we could see during the 2020 election. But this isn't something that they just did on their own. They were under tremendous pressure from specifically Democratic members of Congress after Donald Trump unexpectedly won the 2016 election, which the Democrats blamed on social media posts, many that exposed real and fake information about Hillary Clinton that in some of their opinions we never should have been allowed to see. For example, here's my own Senator, Dianne Feinstein of California, in June 2018 in a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing.
We know that Russia orchestrated a sustained and coordinated attack that interfered in our last presidential election. And we also know that there's a serious threat of more attacks in our future elections, including this November. As the United States intelligence community unanimously concluded, the Russian government's interference in our election, and I quote, blended covert intelligence operations, such as cyber activity, with overt efforts by the Russian government, agencies, state-funded media, third-party intermediaries, and paid social media users or trolls. Over the course of the past year and a half, we've come to better understand how pernicious these attacks were. Particularly unsettling is that we were so unaware. We were unaware that Russia was sowing division through mass propaganda, cyber warfare, and working with malicious actors to tip scales of the election. 13 Russian nationals and 3 organizations, including the Russian-backed Internet Research Agency, have now been indicted for their role in Russia's vast conspiracy to defraud the United States.
Vast conspiracy, please. A private Russian company hired some internet trolls. And if you want the full detail about just how bullshitty that whole thing was, listen to the Mueller Report episode, which I read to get the real facts about what went on in 2016. But that was a perfect example of how some internet trolls that lived in Russia existing was blown out of proportion to the level of attacks by malicious actors involved in a vast conspiracy. And in response to that level of hysteria in Congress, I was concerned because this is the kind of advice Congress was being given. This is Clint Watts. He was a witness that was called to testify in October of 2017 to the Senate. He's a former FBI agent and likely spook who currently works at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is a think tank full of war lovers that has the descendants of Winston Churchill and Dwight Eisenhower on the board. This guy is also a frequent guest on NBC and MSNBC.
Yeah, I admire those social media companies that have begun working to fact-check news articles in the wake of last year's elections. These efforts should continue, but will be completely inadequate. Stopping false information, the artillery barrage landing on social media users comes only when those outlets distributing bogus stories are silenced. Silence the guns and the barrage will end.
And so after years of congressional conversations like that, here's what Facebook ended up doing. And prepare yourself, this is a long list. This is Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, testifying last week to the Senate.
At Facebook, we took our responsibility to protect the integrity of this election very seriously. In 2016, we began to face new kinds of threats, and after years of preparation, we were ready to defend against them. We've built sophisticated systems to protect against election interference that combine artificial intelligence, significant human review, and partnerships with the intelligence community, law enforcement, and other tech platforms. We've taken down more than 100 networks of bad actors who are trying to coordinate and interfere globally. We established a network of independent fact-checkers that covers more than 60 languages. We made political advertising more transparent on Facebook than anywhere else, and including TV, radio, and email. And we introduced new policies to combat voter suppression and misinformation. Still, the pandemic created new challenges. How to handle misinformation about COVID and voting by mail, how to prepare people for the reality that results would take time, and how to handle if someone prematurely declared victory or refused to accept the result. So in September, we updated our policies again to reflect these realities of voting in 2020 and make sure that we were taking precautions given these unique circumstances. We worked with local election officials to remove false claims about polling conditions that might lead to voter suppression. We partnered with Reuters and the National Election Pool to provide reliable information about results. We attached voting information to posts by candidates on both sides and additional contexts to posts trying to delegitimize the outcome. We locked down new political ads in the week before the election to prevent misleading claims from spreading when they couldn't be rebutted. We strengthened our enforcement against militias and conspiracy networks like QAnon to prevent them from using our platforms to organize violence or civil unrest. Altogether, I believe this was the largest election integrity effort by any private company in recent times.
So that was a lot of rule changes. And so let's break that down a bit.
We've built sophisticated systems to protect against election interference that combine artificial intelligence, significant human review, and partnerships with the intelligence community, law enforcement, and other tech platforms.
Okay, so we already know that Facebook uses algorithms to determine what we see and when we see it. But this effort against election interference, which is a very broad term that has always bugged me, they have a lot of manpower behind it. So here's Nathaniel Gleicher, the head of security policy at Facebook, who testified to the House Intelligence Committee in June.
Facebook has made significant investments to help protect the integrity of elections. We now have more than 35,000 people working on safety and security across the company, with nearly 40 teams focused specifically on elections and election integrity. We're also partnering with federal and state governments, other tech companies, researchers, and civil society groups to share information and stop malicious actors. Over the past 3 years, we've worked to protect more than 200 elections around the world. We've learned lessons from each of these, and we're applying these lessons to protect the 2020 election in November.
That's a lot of people working to stop bad and malicious actors on Facebook. Terms that were also never really defined. What makes someone a bad or malicious actor? But I really want to hone in on the cooperation with governments around the world here because, well, actually, Democrat Jim Himes of Connecticut, he verbalized the concern really well on October 15th.
And I should acknowledge that we're pretty careful. We understand that we shouldn't be in the business of fighting misinformation. That's probably inconsistent with the First Amendment. So what do? We ask that it be outsourced to people that we otherwise are pretty critical of, like Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey. We say, you do it, which strikes me as a pretty lame way to address what may or may not be a problem.
That last word there was problem. But anyway, he's right. Private industry playing the role of information gatekeeper can just end up as a backdoor way for governments to censor speech that they can't legally remove from the internet on their own. And there is no doubt that our government, and Facebook in particular, are targeting people for censorship together. Here's Nathaniel Gleicher, the head of security policy at Facebook.
Congressman, the collaboration within industry and with government is much, much better than it was in 2016. I think we have found the FBI, for example, to be forward-leaning and ready to share information with us when they see it. We share information with them whenever we see indications of foreign interference targeting our election. The best case study for this was the 2018 midterms, where you saw industry, government, and civil society all come together, sharing information to tackle these threats. We had a case on literally the eve of the vote where the FBI gave us a tip about a network of accounts where they identified subtle links to Russian actors. We were able to investigate those and take action on them within a matter of hours.
And then CEO Mark Zuckerberg gave more information about how this works just last week when he testified to the Senate.
We do coordinate on and share signals on security-related topics. So, for example, if there is signal around a terrorist attack or around child exploitation imagery or around a foreign government creating an influence operation, that is an area where the companies do share signals about what they see. But I think it's important to be very clear that that is distinct from the content moderation policies that we or the other companies have, where once we share intelligence or signals between the companies, each company makes its own assessment of the right way to address and deal with that information.
And so the government is flagging content that it is alerting Facebook to. And Facebook and Twitter and Google are communicating with each other about these signals that they're getting from the government. And then the private companies determine what to do. So I think we just need to be aware that the government is pointing them at posts that they want targeted. And it's not just the United States government. Here's Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee talking to Mark Zuckerberg.
Do you believe it's Facebook's duty to comply with state-sponsored censorship so it can keep operating, doing business, and selling ads in that country?
Senator, in general, we try to comply with the laws in every country where we operate and do business.
And you know what? This is not surprising. It shouldn't be surprising, because Facebook cooperating with our government to do unconstitutional things has been a problem in this country for a while. There were documents downloaded by a man named Edward Snowden and linked to the press in 2013. Those documents told us about the PRISM program, which is a secret and unconstitutional national security agency program started during the W. Bush administration that paid some of the biggest names in tech, including Facebook and Google, to copy our digital information and send it to the spooks using absurdly broad FISA warrants. And this facilitated the bulk government collection of millions of innocent people's digital communications. Both Facebook and Google joined the secret program in 2009, and so we already know that these companies have a shady history of providing the government with backdoors around our First Amendment rights. Facebook in this hearing, as you just heard, essentially testified that they will do what governments ask them to do. And as for Google, they refused to send a representative to that hearing. Now, the catalyst for that November 17th hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee was the censorship of an October 14th New York Post article about Joe Biden's party boy son Hunter, which was about emails somehow found on a laptop and provided to the New York Post by Trump's despicable personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. But just because the source is a scumbag, that doesn't make the emails fake. In fact, one of the people who was in one of the email chains has confirmed that at least that email chain is legit. Now, I put the New York Post article in the show notes for you if you want to go down the rabbit hole on the story. I personally don't find the idea that nepotism probably existed in the Obama administration all that interesting, considering that Ivanka Trump has spent the last 4 years in the White House. And we've already established in 20 Congressional Dish episodes that Joe Biden, as vice president, was a key figure in the replacement of Ukraine's old government and in puppeteering the new one. That is the far more interesting story to me, and this New York Post article had nothing new to add to it. But the fact that caused the Republicans in charge of the Senate Judiciary Committee to haul the CEOs of Facebook and Twitter into Congress was that both platforms limited the reach of that New York Post article, an article that was related to the job performance and possible corruption of one of the leading candidates for president of the United States during an election. And I don't care who the candidate is. No one should be hiding information from us about them, especially during an election. Censorship of news is election interference, and this time the interference was done by the tech companies. And so here's what they told Congress. Here's Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter.
We were called here today because of an enforcement decision we made against the New York Post based on a policy we created in 2018 to prevent Twitter from being used to spread hacked materials. This resulted in us blocking people from sharing a New York Post article, publicly or privately. We made a quick interpretation, using no other evidence, that the materials in the article were obtained through hacking, and according to our policy, we blocked them from being spread. Upon further consideration, we admitted this action was wrong and corrected it within 24 hours. We informed the New York Post of our error and policy update and how to unlock their account by deleting the original violating tweet, which freed them to tweet the exact same content and news article again. They chose not to, instead insisting we reverse our enforcement action. We did not have a practice around retroactively overturning prior enforcements. This incident demonstrated that we needed one, and so we created one we believe is fair and appropriate.
So first of all, Twitter had a policy against sharing hacked materials. And if that had been a policy back in 2013, that would have prevented all of us from seeing the Snowden documents, because those documents were hacked by Edward Snowden when he was working as a private contractor for Booz Allen Hamilton and had access to government documents in that position. We also would have been prevented from seeing or sharing John Podesta's emails, which is how we know that the Democratic National Committee ran an unfair primary in 2016, a primary that was funded by Hillary Clinton and that stacked the deck against her main competitor, Bernie Sanders. If a policy preventing the sharing of hacked materials had existed during the Obama years, that would have prevented me from using the platform I use the most to share information, Twitter, to share with you some of the most important information about our government and elections in the last decade. Now, in this instance, Twitter said they made a mistake in preventing the spread of the New York Post article, and they've reportedly changed their hacked materials policy, a policy which only became a thing out of nowhere in 2018. Now they say that they will no longer remove hacked content unless shared directly by hackers or by those, quote, acting in concert with them, unquote, which to me could easily mean journalists. I mean, like, Snowden hacked the documents and then gave them to Glenn Greenwald. So doesn't that mean that Greenwald, the journalist, would have been acting in concert with Snowden to show us the documents? And so I'm still not okay with that policy existing. But it is what it is. And the point of all this is that we are powerless to do anything about it. And so in general, the new policy at Twitter says that links to hacked material that don't violate other policies, so like their no kiddie porn policy or the policy against posting other people's private information. Well, they said that hacked materials can be posted and shared, but that Twitter might apply labels to it and possibly add links to more information. But the bigger picture is that Twitter is clearly making up the rules as they go and changing them on the fly. And then there's Facebook, which also limited the reach of the New York Post article at the exact same time that Twitter was limiting it, which kind of goes back to they are coordinating with each other. But just for some backstory, when the New York Post story was released and our ability to see and share it limited by Twitter and Facebook, it was widely being reported that the New York Post article was based on Russian disinformation. How many times already in this episode have we heard them justifying taking down content because it's a foreign operation to interfere in elections or whatever? And so that New York Post article is an example of that. We were being told that it was Russian disinformation, disinformation being a term that implies lies. And so here's an example of the common wisdom from that week about the article that was being spread. This clip is from October 16th on CNN. And here you're going to hear the accusations set up by Wolf Blitzer with no fact checks, and then confidently confirmed by the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, pathological liar Adam Schiff.
Federal authorities, including the FBI, are investigating whether recently published emails that purport to detail, the business dealings of Joe Biden's son, Hunter, are connected to an ongoing Russian disinformation effort targeting the Biden campaign in the days leading up to the election. Let's discuss with the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Adam Schiff. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us. Does it surprise you at all that this information Rudy Giuliani is peddling very well could be connected to some sort of Russian government disinformation campaign?
Well, we know that this whole smear on Joe Biden comes from the Kremlin. That's been clear for well over a year now that they've been pushing this false narrative about the vice president and his son. And, you know, the idea that the president, that the White House counsel and others were made aware that Giuliani was being used by Russian intelligence and using Russian intelligence in the sense of meeting with an agent of the Kremlin and pushing out this Kremlin false narrative. The idea that they were knowing and still on the floor of the Senate during the impeachment trial pushing this Kremlin narrative is pretty breathtaking. But I guess at this point, we can't be shocked by anything this administration does, no matter how craven. But clearly, the origins of this whole smear are from the Kremlin, and the president is only too happy to have Kremlin help in trying to amplify it.
All of that about the origins of the New York Post article being Russian disinformation, there is absolutely no evidence of that being the case. In fact, our own intelligence officials, 50 of them, said in writing, quote, "We do not have evidence of Russian involvement," unquote. But this was allowed to be presented to the American public as fact on the authoritative CNN newscast. Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, a Republican, who you're going to hear questioning Mark Zuckerberg in this next clip, well, he requested that the FBI also look into the accusations that this was all Russian disinformation. And the FBI confirmed that so far, they too have no evidence that the Russians were involved. And so a week after getting that confirmation of a lack of evidence of Russian involvement from the FBI, Senator Ron Johnson got to question Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook.
Mr. Zuckerberg?
Senator, as I testified before, we relied heavily on the FBI's intelligence and alerts to us, both through their public testimony and private briefings and alerts they gave us.
Did the FBI contact you and say the New York Post story was false?
Senator, not about that story specifically.
Why did you throttle it back?
General.
Why did you throttle it back?
They alerted us to be on heightened alert around a risk of hack and leak operations, around a release of information. And Senator, to be clear on this, we didn't censor the content. We flagged it for fact checkers to review, and pending that review, we temporarily constrained its distribution to make sure that it didn't spread wildly while it was being reviewed. But it's not up to us either to determine whether it's Russian interference nor whether it's true. We rely on the FBI and intelligence and fact checkers to do that.
And so Facebook was told to watch out for Russian disinformation, and that's what stopped the story. So it's not like something has to be from Russia or any other country, or even disinformation. As long as the government labels it as such and targets it and tells Facebook and Twitter to do something, they're acting on it. And the New York Post article saga really puts that into clear focus, because there was nothing wrong with that article. Right now, you can share it on social media anywhere you want to. But at a time when it really mattered, right before the election, it was slowed down and people were prevented from seeing it. And that could easily happen again. And so Facebook, they said that their solution was that they put it through their fact check process, which to its credit is clearly more robust than CNN's. But let's take a look at Facebook's fact check process just to see what it is. So if something gets flagged, or if the fact checkers themselves find something that they think might be misinformation, they look into it. And that right there, the fact that Facebook is going out looking for stuff tells us that Facebook is playing truth police. They are hunting for information to take down. Then the second step is that the fact checkers then check it for facts and rate its accuracy. Now, Facebook is not involved in this process. This is outsourced, and I'll get to whom it's outsourced to in a minute. But Facebook, if the information is false, will put a label on the post saying it's been reviewed by the fact checkers and then provides additional context. And so there's a bunch of labels that the fact checkers can put on a post. There's 6 of them. So the post can be labeled as true, satire, missing context, partly false, altered, or false. But if a post is false, Facebook will send a notification to anyone who shared it and then notify people who try to share it that the information is false before they're able to do so. And as I've seen with my crazy Facebook friends' posts, the post remains up, but Facebook changes it. So they either delete the information, leaving no indication of what used to be there, or they blur it out and put a warning on top. And so you have to click if you want to see what's underneath it before it becomes visible. Then, once a post is labeled false, Facebook purposely limits its visibility in news feeds, and it's eliminated from search on Instagram. And then 5th, pages that repeatedly share information that fact checkers consider false will have their post distribution reduced even more than it already is. And I have noticed that my crazy Facebook friend doesn't show up in my feed as much as she used to, which really doesn't bother me, but still, it's kind of creepy that Facebook is doing that. Because who are the ones that gets to decide what is and isn't true? That matters too. And so here's what Mark Zuckerberg told Congress.
We work with a number of independent organizations that are accredited by the Poynter Institute, and they include Reuters, the Associated Press, Agence France Presse, United States, USA Today, factcheck.org, Science Feedback, PolitiFact, Check Your Fact, Lead Stories, and The Dispatch in the United States.
But the list is actually much longer than that. There are 91 verified fact-checking organizations, and it doesn't appear to me that you can find out who exactly fact-checks each individual post. I looked through the list, and there are dozens of outlets from around the world that I've never heard of. But, to be fair, there was also no one that jumped out at me as a clear red flag, like they didn't have the CIA or anyone listed. Although who knows who some of those foreign outlets are. Twitter, on the other hand, is taking a more hands-off approach than Facebook is. Here's Jack Dorsey.
We don't have a policy against misinformation. We have a policy against misinformation in 3 categories, which are manipulated media, public health, specifically COVID, and civic integrity, election interference, and voter suppression.
And here's Nick Pickles, who has one of my favorite names ever, but he is also the Director of Global Public Policy Strategy and Development at Twitter. Here he is testifying in June 2020.
Firstly, Twitter shouldn't determine the truthfulness of tweets. And secondly, Twitter should provide context to help people make up their own minds in cases where the substance of a tweet is disputed.
And he continued,
where content does not break our rules and warrant removal. In these 3 areas, we may label tweets to help people come to their own views by providing additional context. These labels may link to a curated set of tweets posted by people on Twitter that include factual statements, counterpoint opinions and perspectives, and ongoing public conversation around the issue. To date, we've applied these labels to thousands of tweets around the world across these 3 policy areas.
And so Twitter has opted to provide more information when they detect lies instead of hiding and deleting posts, which in my opinion is definitely better. Here's Jack Dorsey again.
The goal of our labeling is to provide more context, to connect the dots so that people can have more information so they can make decisions for themselves.
Now let's compare that with Facebook, which is far more active in just straight up silencing people. Here's Mark Zuckerberg.
We've taken down more than 100 networks of bad actors who are trying to coordinate and interfere globally. We worked with local election officials to remove false claims about polling conditions that might lead to voter suppression. We locked down new political ads in the week before the election to prevent misleading claims from spreading when they couldn't be rebutted. We strengthened our enforcement against militias and conspiracy networks like QAnon to prevent them from using our platforms to organize violence or civil unrest.
Now, Mark Zuckerberg named the bad guys, QAnon, dun dun dun. But in general, they are far more broad when describing their targets in other settings. So here's Nathaniel Gleicher. He's the head of security policy at Facebook, and here he is testifying last June.
We've also been proactively hunting for bad actors, trying to interfere with the important discussions about injustice and inequality happening around our nation. As part of this effort, we've removed isolated accounts seeking to impersonate activists, and 2 networks of accounts tied to organized hate groups that we'd previously banned from our platforms.
Bad actors? Again, what is that? And what's the difference between an impersonated activist and an activist? They're saying that they're taking down entire networks of users. So is that guilt by association? What if I join a group just to see what they're up to, but I don't actually, participate? If you take down entire networks of people without actually knowing their involvement, that seems pretty broad too. And I'm disturbed that they're specifically trying to prevent people from organizing. We have the right to assemble in this country. And just because a group gets labeled as a militia, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are. One of the most interesting conversations in all of these hearings was along this line between Democrat Representative Jim Himes of Connecticut and Nina Jankowicz, whose official title is the Disinformation Fellow at the Wilson Center. Now, Nina Jankowicz has come up on my radar before, and she's someone who just creeps me out. She was a manager of democracy assistance, whatever the hell that means, to Russia and Belarus when she worked at the National Democratic Institute, which should be a red flag for anyone who listened to the National Endowment for Democracy episode, which I put in the show notes. That is a must listen. But the National Democratic Institute is basically an organization full of high-ranking Democratic Party members, some of them current members of Congress, that specializes in regime change operations. So she was in that. And then she also provided expertise to the new Ukrainian government, you know, the one that Biden helped install in 2016 and 2017 as a Fulbright Clinton fellow. And so I don't trust this chick as far as I can throw her. But the Democrats do, especially the ones hell-bent on restarting the Cold War with Russia. Like Adam Schiff, the head of the House Select Committee on Intelligence, who hosted the October 15th hearing and asked Nina Jankowicz to testify, to lend her expertise to the committee. In her opening statement, she said that misinformation, so like lies on the internet, was dismantling our democracy. Which when she said it, I remember thinking, oh, you mean like information on the internet dismantled the Clinton campaign? And then I like laughed to myself, but I was just like, what the fuck, you know? Well, apparently that phrase raised an eyebrow for Representative Jim Himes too, and he pushed her on it when it was his turn to ask questions. And this is the conversation that resulted.
So Ms. Yankovic said that misinformation is dismantling democracy. I'm skeptical of that, and that will be my question. What evidence is out there that this is dismantling democracy? I don't mean that millions of people see QAnon. I actually want to see the evidence that people are seeing this information and are in a meaningful way, in a material way, dismantling our democracy through violence or through political organizations. Because if we're going to go down that path, I need something more than eyeballs. So I need some evidence for how this is dismantling our democracy. And secondly, if you persuade me that we're dismantling our democracy, how do we get in the business of figuring out who should define what misinformation or disinformation is?
To address your first question related to evidence of the dismantling of democracy, there's two news stories that I think point to this from the last couple of weeks alone. The first is related to the kidnapping plot against Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. The social media platforms played a huge role in allowing that group to organize. It allowed, that group to, it seeded the information that led them to organize. And frankly, that is an indication that they are murderers and not that they are dismantling democracy, but, continue. As a woman online who has been getting harassed a lot lately with sexualized and gendered disinformation, I am very acutely aware of how those threats that are online can transfer onto real world violence. And that, make no mistake, is meant to keep women and minorities from not only participating in the democratic process by exercising our votes, but also keeping us from public life. So that's one big example. But there was another example just recently from a Channel 4 in the UK documentary that looked at how the Trump campaign used Cambridge Analytica data to selectively target Black voters with voter suppression ads during the 2016 election. Again, this is, it's affecting people's participation. It's not just about fake news, stories on the internet. In fact, a lot of the best disinformation is grounded in a kernel of truth. And in my written testimony, I go through a couple of other examples of how online action has led to real world action. This isn't something that is just staying on the internet. It is increasingly in real life. But even there, and what kind of kills me about what she said, it's like, just because a post ends up on your feed doesn't mean that you believe it. Did the election still go forward? Were the polling places still there? The infrastructure of our democracy does not change in any way if there's a social media post. It was such bullshit. But back to Jim Himes.
I don't have a lot of time. Do you think that both examples that you offered up, the plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, and your other example, passed the but-for test? I mean, this country probably got into the Spanish-American War over 130 years ago because of the good works of William Randolph Hearst. So how do we've had misinformation and yellow journalism and terrible media and voter suppression forever. And I understand that these media platforms have scale that William Randolph Hearst didn't have. But are you sure that both of those examples passed the but-for? They wouldn't have happened without the social media misinformation?
I believe they do, because they allow the organization of these groups without any oversight, and they allow the targeting of these messages to the groups and people that are going to find them most vulnerable and are most likely to take action against them. And that's what our foreign adversaries do. And increasingly, it's what people within our own country are using to organize violence and against the democratic participation of many of our fellow citizens.
Okay, well, I'm out of time. I would love to continue this conversation and pursue what you mean by groups being formed, quote, without oversight. That also is language I'd like to better understand. But I'm out of time. But I would like to continue this conversation into, well, if this is the problem that you say it is, what do we actually do about it?
And so we've heard from Facebook itself that they're aiming to make it harder for some groups to organize. And now we have this creepy bitch, clearly a regime changer and some kind of Clinton fellow, advocating for more censorship and for us to be prevented from organizing without oversight. I mean, these are the people that are a danger to our democracy. These are the people that are a danger to our First Amendment rights to free speech and to organize. That's a big part of what makes us an American. And she wants us to have oversight over our ability to organize. Like, no. And what's most concerning is that it was the Democrats who were on this lady's side. They were the ones that were pushing for more censorship. And the Democrats are about to take over the law enforcement branch of government. And one of the most concerning people on this issue is Representative Jackie Speer of California. She represents the Bay Area district where Facebook is headquartered. And so here's an example of what she's looking for in her interactions with Facebook. This is a clip from June, and in it she's talking to Nathaniel Gleicher, the head of security policy at Facebook.
How long, or maybe I should ask this, when there was a video of Speaker Pelosi that had been tampered with, slowed down to make her look like she was drunk, YouTube took it down almost immediately. What did Facebook do, and what went into your thinking to keep it up?
Congresswoman, for a piece of content like that, we work with a network of third-party fact checkers, more than 60 third-party fact checkers around the world. If one of them determines that a piece of content like that is false, then we will downrank it and we will put an interstitial on it so that anyone who would look at it would first see a label over it saying that there's additional information and that it's false. That's what we did in this context. When we downrank something like that, we see the shares of that video radically drop.
But you won't take it down when you know it's false.
Congresswoman, you're highlighting a really difficult balance, and we've talked about this amongst ourselves quite a bit. And what I would say is, if we simply take a piece of content like this down, it doesn't go away. It will exist elsewhere on the internet. People who are looking for it will still find it.
Well, I understand that, but there will always be bad actors in the world. That doesn't mean that you don't do your level best to show the greatest deal of credibility. I mean, if YouTube took it down, I don't understand how you couldn't have taken it down, but I'll leave that where it lays.
And she wasn't the only Democrat using their time to target specific posts and people that they don't like for censorship. Here's Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut talking to Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg just last week.
How many times has Steve Bannon allowed the call for the murder of government officials before Facebook suspends his account?
Senator, as you say, the content in question did violate our policies and we took it down. Having a content violation does not automatically mean your account gets taken down, and the number of strikes varies depending on the type of offense. So if people are posting terrorist content or child exploitation content, then the first time that they do it, then we will take down their account. For other things, it's multiple. I'd be happy to follow up afterwards. We try not to disclose these.
Down his account.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Will you commit to taking down that account, Steve Bannon's account?
Senator, no, that's not what our policies would suggest that we should do in this case.
I see a problem here. They're pushing for the silencing of posts and people, specific posts and people. It couldn't be more clear. With Facebook being as cozy with governments as it is, it's easy to see how this can be expanded to silence all kinds of information if that's what the government wants, as long as the government puts the right label on the post to target it for Facebook. I mean, in this example, it's Facebook being like, nah, you're asking for more censorship than we're comfortable with. But Facebook's pretty comfortable with a lot of censorship, you know? And I mean, think about the New York Post article. All the government had to do, and who only knows in the government, but someone labeled that as Russian disinformation, and both Facebook and Twitter took action against it, even though it wasn't. That article was, in reality, temporarily banned because it was labeled in a way that got the censors to act. But what happens to the posts of people who don't have the reach and power of the New York Post, which is a publication that, while it is a tabloid today, it was something that was founded by Alexander Hamilton. And so the outrage about that post was loud. But how often is this happening to publishers without that signal strength? And like I said, the government is soon to be controlled by Democrats. And while there are a few exceptions, like Jim Himes,
I tend to be kind of a First Amendment absolutist. I really don't want Facebook telling me what's true and what's not true, mainly because most statements are some combination of both.
Jim Himes exists, but most Democrats sounded more like this. This is Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts.
The issue is not that the companies before us today are taking too many posts down. The issue is that they're leaving too many dangerous posts up. In fact, they're amplifying harmful content so that it spreads like wildfire and torches our democracy.
I found the Democrats' behavior in these hearings deeply disturbing. Between their blaming Hillary Clinton's election loss on social media posts to these recent demands of the social media titans in Congress, I really don't like where this is headed, as the host of a podcast that doesn't parrot the Democratic Party line. I think I'm still too small. I don't think they know who I am. This podcast is still very much a guppy in the media pond. But if Congressional Dish ever got on their radar, my Ukraine coverage alone would guarantee that the Democrats would not like me. And I do feel a bit of a target forming on my back. But there are others with targets on their backs already. And so speaking of silencing people that the Democrats don't like, here's what Facebook and Twitter are planning to do about our current president, Donald Trump, after he leaves office. This is Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii talking to Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey last week.
I wonder, what are both of you prepared to do regarding Donald Trump's use of your platforms after he stops being president? Will he still be deemed newsworthy, and will he still get to use your platforms to spread his misinformation?
Senator, let me clarify my last answer. We are also having academics study the effect of all of our election measures, and they'll be publishing those results publicly. In terms of President Trump and moving forward, there are a small number of policies where we have exceptions for politicians under the principle that people should be able to hear what their elected officials are saying and candidates for office. But by and large, the vast majority of our policies have no newsworthiness or political exception. So if the president or anyone else is spreading hate speech or inciting violence, or posting content that delegitimizes the election or valid forms of voting, those will receive the same treatment as anyone else saying those things. And that will continue to be the case.
Remains to be seen. Mr. Dorsey?
So we do have a policy around public interest, where for global leaders, we do make exceptions in terms of whether if a tweet violates our terms of service, we leave it up, but we leave it up behind an interstitial, and people are not allowed to share that more broadly. So a lot of the sharing is disabled, with the exception of quoting it, so that you can add your own conversation on top of it. So if an account suddenly is not a world leader anymore, that particular policy goes away.
And so on Twitter, at least, Trump's tweets are going to lose their protection on January 20th at noon. And that should be a fun meltdown to witness. Not that I plan to follow him anymore. But what I will follow in the new year are the developments when it comes to social media censorship in the 117th Congress, because this was just the beginning. The debate going forward about this is clearly going to be focused on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which says that, quote, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider, unquote. So basically, online services that serve as infrastructure for sharing, so Facebook, Google, Twitter, all of them, they're all protected against a bunch of laws that might otherwise be used to hold them legally responsible for what is said on their infrastructure. This applies to internet service providers too, like Comcast, AT&T, and whoever else you pay for access to the internet. But it also applies to just about any service that hosts content that they didn't actually create. This protects people like me from getting sued for things that you say in the comment sections of my website. And it protects you when you retweet someone else or forward a meme. Now, some people think that Section 230 needs to be changed. Here's Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida talking to David Shavern, the president of the News Media Alliance.
Section 230, as I understand it, and I'm happy to be corrected by others, would say that if a technology platform is a neutral public platform, that they enjoy certain liability protections that newspapers don't enjoy, that News Corp doesn't enjoy with its assets. And so does it make the anti-competitive posture of technology platforms more pronounced, that they have access to this special liability protection that the people you represent don't have access to?
Oh, absolutely. There's a huge disparity, frankly, when our content's delivered through these platforms. We get the liability and they get the money. So that's a good deal from that end. We are responsible for what we publish. Publishers can and do get sued. On the other hand, the platforms are allowed to deliver and monetize this content with complete lack of responsibility.
Now, for this reason, you might think that Facebook and Twitter would fight like hell to prevent any changes to 230. But that actually isn't the case. Here's Senator Lindsey Graham talking to Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey of Facebook and Twitter.
Do both of you support change to 230, reform of Section 230?
Senator, I do.
Mr. Dorsey?
Yes.
Thank you.
Now, this might not make sense because changes to Section 230 could expose Facebook and Twitter to more lawsuits. But the thing is that Facebook and Twitter and Google, they're already huge and insanely profitable. They have armies of lawyers on standby. They've already built workforces for censorship and created all the algorithms. And so if they lose protection for what we post, they have tens of thousands of speech police that they need on standby already, and they have the money to pay them. They can afford whatever regulation the government throws at them. But you know who can't? Just about anyone else. If the legal immunity that Facebook, Google, Twitter, all of them enjoyed while growing were weakened or eliminated, that's almost certain to destroy any chance that new competitors could enter the market. Here's Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas making a really good point.
Whatever the numbers are, you indicate that they are significant. It's an enormous amount of money and an enormous amount of employee time, contract labor time in dealing with modification of content. These efforts are expensive, and I would highlight for my colleagues on the committee that they will not be any less expensive, perhaps less in scale, but not less in cost for startups and small businesses. And as we develop our policies in regard to this topic, I want to make certain that entrepreneurship, startup businesses, and small business are considered in what it would cost in their efforts to meet the kind of standards that to operate in this sphere.
And I can tell you that this is one of the main reasons why I've been resisting requests for 8 years and running to host any kind of Congressional Dish forum. I don't have the time or honestly emotional bandwidth to personally play politeness police on the forum, which means that I'd have to hire at least one person to do it. And if this podcast were to ever get big, I'd probably need a whole team of people to moderate the comments, because I certainly don't want any Congressional Dish producers to be spoken to disrespectfully when in my house. If I could, on top of that, also be sued for what you say at my house, door closed. I wouldn't even allow Patreon comments anymore. It just wouldn't be worth the risk. I would definitely not be the only one to make that calculation. And so hosting infrastructure for the conversations of others simply must keep some kind of legal protections. We need more places to speak to each other, not fewer. And the debate about Section 230 in Congress is a really fascinating one. And it's not possible to judge where someone is in Congress, where they are in this, by judging them based on what party they're in. Like Jim Himes and Jackie Spear, they're both Democrats, but they are not on the same side on this one. And the Republicans are all over the place too. But the brand of Republican that I'm concerned with in this area are the ones that bleated out this recurring and extremely annoying line of thought, which was expressed by so many whiny elephants over the course of all these hearings. Like, for example, here's Senator Mike Lee of Utah.
between the censorship of conservative and liberal points of view. And it's an enormous disparity. Now, you have the right, I want to be very clear about this, you have every single right to set your own terms of service and to interpret them and to make decisions about violations. But given the disparate impact of who gets censored on your platforms, it seems that you're either, one, not enforcing your terms of service equally, or alternatively, two, that you're writing your standards to target conservative viewpoints.
And here's Senator Rick Fox of Florida.
But it's becoming obvious that your companies are unfairly targeting conservatives. That's clearly the perception today. Facebook is actively targeting ads by conservative groups ahead of the election, either removing the ads completely or adding their own disclosure if they claim it didn't pass their fact check system.
I heard clips like that over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And it apparently didn't occur to any of these Republicans that conservative posts are often labeled as false because they're sharing information easily proven to be bullshit. But regardless, Republicans lined up to play the victim in every hearing. They don't like that conservative crap is being called out as false, and they want the labeling to stop. And this particular brand of Republican, they're using the threat of removing liability protection as a weapon. Here's Senator Rick Scott of Florida.
You can't just pick and choose which viewpoints are allowed on your platform, expect to keep the immunity granted by Section 230.
Which, yes, is a dumb strategy if you take 5 seconds to think about it, because if the tech companies can be held liable for conservative lies, they aren't going to be more likely to allow them to be posted. They will be less likely to allow them on their platforms. But this is what I mean about this debate being fascinating. There's so much dumb to go around. But the problem is that we hired the vast majority of these morons to the 117th Congress, and they clearly want to change the law in this area. They need guidance from us. And as for the changes being suggested, this is the only one that I really liked. This is Stacey Mitchell. She's the co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance.
I hope the committee will consider several policy tools as part of this investigation. In particular, we very much endorse the approach that Congress took with regard to the railroads, that if you operate essential infrastructure, you can't also compete with the businesses that rely on that infrastructure.
I think that's going to be key to the solution here, because these platforms are infrastructure, and perhaps it's time that they be treated as such. They aren't cute little startups in garages anymore. They're essential internet services with the power to make or break businesses, even industries. And I also think it's important to allow these industries to sue these companies for decisions that they make about whose posts get seen and whose don't, because right now it's way too arbitrary and it's changing all the time. You know, at the very least, the rules should be clear and applied equally to everyone. And right now, they're clearly creating the rules as they go. But that's about all that was clear in this. You know, the topic is just a world of nuance. But we have to pay close attention to the conversations in Congress to come about this, because it will determine the power of the gatekeepers, both government and private. In a country where we're supposed to pick our leaders, you know, we're supposed to determine our future. And if that is the case, then access to information is key. We can't just allow the only information that we see to be corporate. The only thing I know for sure is that we need to create and protect our rights to share information. We cannot give corporate titans, who are definitely partnered with government officials, the power to silence whoever they want. That will be the end of the internet as we know it, and all of the potential that it holds for creating a better world, a fairer world, that isn't designed to maximize profits for corporations and the investor class that they funnel money to. If we allow the gatekeepers to silence people, and let's be real here, I'm talking about people like me, all we will hear is the corporate line of thought. And we're already seeing this dynamic being set up, with the prioritization of corporate content as authoritative and reliable, while independent sources are relegated to the back pages. We're already seeing these platforms putting independents out of business by demanding ransoms for post views and competing for ad dollars with the companies whose posts they are preventing from being seen. In the next Congress, they are either going to stop this from progressing or cement this dynamic into law. And so it's up to us to watch and participate in this discussion. Because if we're silent, I promise you, they will give the tech titans who fund their campaigns and are given all these opportunities to testify, they will get the legal license and maybe even the obligation to silence all the troublemakers. And I think the key to this, and so many of our problems, is the fact that just a few companies have all the power. I think what's going to be key is that the mergers need to be stopped. And people like me with businesses like Congressional Dish, we need other options for sharing and for interacting with the world. And we also need a way to organize so that we can have some kind of power to fight the decisions that these companies are making. Now, in these hearings, I was happy to confirm that I think I made the right decision by spending my limited social media time developing my following on Twitter. I do have to say that Twitter was by far the company most interested in allowing us to share and least willing to permanently ban people. They didn't want the role of police. Facebook, however, well, you just heard. But we should have more options than this. Every time there's something new, Facebook or Google fucking buys it and either integrates that company into themselves or destroys it, like all the companies that they bought that were never heard from again. And so this is to be continued. We'll have to see where this goes in the 117th. Before I wrap up this episode, I would like to thank our producers. Like I said earlier in the episode, this is a value for value model funded podcast. This is why I can say the things that I say to you. This is why I can not play the social media game. I can produce episodes that are probably not going to go viral, but seem to be valuable to you. I can give you all my sources. I can do everything I do here because you are supporting this show. And I do this full time. And the way that this works is I produce the show up front. I give it to you for free, and then you return it in some kind of financial form at whatever amount feels fair to you. Now, every single producer of Congressional Dish does get thanked on the air, and you can have your messages read to the community in the thank you episodes. But we do have some executive producers who are people that contribute $535 or more, who are able to pick an episode of their choice or multiple episodes if they pay that much. But for every cumulative $535 payment, you get an executive producer credit. So I would like to thank and congratulate Rhonda Kisner, who is our executive producer for episode 223, the election 2020 episode, The Empire Returns. She said that she really liked it. Rhonda, you've been a longtime supporter of the show. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the producers. If you would like to be a producer of Congressional Dish, God knows that I need you. So please visit the show notes where you can get the sources for everything that I said to you today in this episode. You can also get timestamps and transcripts of every sound clip so you can listen to them in context. It's the most important thing that I do because trust is earned. But go to the show notes, and that is also where you can find all of the different options for contributing to Congressional Dish. We have Patreon, which is a per episode thing. There's also lots of monthly options. You can pay with credit card and get airline miles so that when COVID is over, you can use those miles to go and see the world. I mean, there's so many options. There's also a mailbox there, so you can send physical checks. Lots of options for you, but however much you pay, as long as it's more than zero, that feels fair to me. So yeah, thank you all to the producers. I hope you have a happy Thanksgiving, and I'll talk to you soon now that Congress is back to work. All right, take care. Bye-bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end he'll justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.